Hey, APUSH gang, it is about 4:30 on Tuesday. I am trying to finish up your quiz. I think I've got your quiz done and just want to do a really quick little bit of review before your quiz opens up. Not much. I feel like we've really covered most of it, and if you watch those videos, I think you'll be good to go. What I thought I would do is just real quickly go over the period questions and definitions just to make sure you're tracking well. I haven't even looked at them, so I'm going to look at them right now and see what I can offer you in addition to what you've already studied. So you were supposed to do number 1 and number 3, the definitions. So federalism and separation of powers. I think we've covered it pretty exhaustively, but federalism, not to be confused with the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. The Anti-Federalist and the Federalist deals with the debate about whether or not to ratify the Constitution and to support a stronger centralized or federal government. But the idea of federalism is the idea woven into the Constitution that the federal government and the state governments would be operating kind of simultaneously with different responsibilities. I think the example that I used was the federal government is responsible for protecting our borders, protecting our securities, protecting our property rights. That's a big part of what they do. Whereas our state governments operate local defenses like police, potentially the National Guard, overseeing public schools, public roads, local laws and institutions. And so they kind of work together. Ultimately, the Constitution, the federal government, is the final say, but the states have all kinds of rights that they are also, and responsibilities that they're also performing at the same time. So that's what federalism is. I don't know why they use that expression to define that, because it says federalism, it's federal, but that's what federalism is. So, and then of course separation of powers. Sometimes actually your book aligned separation of powers and checks and balances together, essentially saying that the reason that the founders created 3 separate branches of government, all with their own responsibilities, was in order to put in place checks and balances that would prevent the abuse of power. And so each of those branches of government, the legislative branch makes laws, the executive branch enforces those laws, and then the judicial branch interprets those laws. And they each have tools in their basket, in their toolbox, that they can use to prevent the overreach of power. A modern day example of that might be the presidential election in some circles is still in dispute. The states are required to certify those based upon their secretaries of states in each of the states and based upon their own state laws. And then the president's team can dispute that the executive branch can dispute those by going to court, using the court systems to potentially prevent states from certifying elections they think have been fraudulent. Ultimately, that can be taken all the way to the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court were to rule in favor of President Trump and throw out a bunch of votes or declare that there was fraudulent attempts in the election, like for instance with these voting machines or whatever, and Joe Biden would be prohibited from acquiring a certain number of electoral votes from their delegates. Let's say he doesn't reach the 270 threshold. He still is ahead of Donald Trump, but he doesn't meet the required 270 majority. Then it would get sent to the House of Representatives, or the House of Representatives would get to choose the president. And each state would get 1 vote, and each state would, and every member of the state delegation would have to agree before that state could cast their vote. So there's all these checks and balances worked into the system to avoid corruption or abuse of power. So that was those were the 2 that you were supposed to finish for today. And then numbers 10 through 16. Number 10 says, what were the major issues confronting the United States during the 1971 to 1788 1781 to 1788 period. So this is, of course, is the time when the Articles of Confederation were in place. The federal government was too weak to enforce laws. They couldn't raise taxes. They couldn't defend their own people's individual property rights. You have Shays' Rebellion and a whole bunch of other things coming to a head. I would say that the primary concern during this period of time was the inability of the government to protect people's property rights. And for people living at that time, that was the most important function of the federal government, to protect what they owe, what belonged to them. And if the government couldn't do that, the government was completely useless. And so a new constitution had to be written to kind of overcome that. Shays' Rebellion is part of that period of time. The conflict about how to trade between states, how to have a uniform system of rules and taxes and tariffs that were effective all across the board, and then also international trade, money, 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 you know. So number 11, why was the government under the article so limited? Because there was only one branch of government, the legislative branch. They had to act unanimously to amend the Articles of Confederation, and it required 9 of the 13 states to pass laws, which was a supermajority. It was just really very, very difficult. And just the principle behind limiting the Articles of Confederation was that concern and fear of an oppressive federal or centralized power like a monarch in England. The states wanted the authority and the right and the freedom to do whatever they wanted to do at the expense of national unity. So number 12, how did the land ordinances of 1785 and 1787 help regulate the settlement of Western territories? So both of these laws had different functions. The land ordinance of 1785 set forth a plan by which to it's the one that actually took the Western lands and broke them up into 640 square acre or square mile plots, and there was a section within each 640 acres that was supposed to be set aside for education and schooling. It essentially was the surveying hand of this new land grab that the federal government had acquired from the states, who finally were willing to give them up when the Articles of Confederation was ratified. And then this, the land ordinance of 1787 specifically forbid slavery in the old Northwest territories, and that was probably the most, I mean, there was a lot of things important about those land ordinances, but that, of course, was extremely significant looking down into the future. Number 13, what were the major achievements of the governments under the Articles of Confederation? It would be those land ordinances and getting us through the American Revolution, because it did. Major problems we've already talked about. Number 14, why did the farmers launch Shays' Rebellion? What was the rebellion's most important legacy? So they launched it because of the debtor courts that were throwing people in prison who could not afford to pay off their debts. It was a ridiculous system, and so people took up arms against their own government and closed those debtor courts. It really was a sense that the leaders who had been elected were not listening to the economic despair of the people of their states, and it was spreading. The sentiment was spreading. The most important legacy of it, of course, is that Shays' Rebellion in particular is what launched the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention was convened in order to reevaluate the Articles of Confederation and see how they could be changed to meet this very urgent need of governing. And of course, they recognized pretty quickly that the Articles of Confederation could not be redeemed. They were going to ditch them. That wasn't the intent on going to the Constitutional Convention. However, that's what it became. So, what was the Constitution's position on slavery? That's number 15. It never uses the word slavery, but it definitely categorizes 3 groups of people. Us people, we people. I think it refers to the other people, which is referring to indentured servants or slaves, people who are enslaved to others, and then the native tribes. And so the Constitution allowed slavery. It provided for the counting of slaves, 3 out of every 5 slaves for the purposes of population and counting population for representation in the House of Representatives. And then there was a clause in there that forbid Congress from making any laws to forbid the African slave trade until 20 years removed from the ratification of the Constitution. So it definitely allowed slavery. It how does the book say? It ingrained slavery as a part of our national fabric because it gave it roots, unfortunately. Fortunately, that's been amended, and that is no longer part of our Constitution, but it was certainly at the very beginning. And number 16, who were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and what were their different visions for federal and state government. So your Federalists are those that understand that we need a more significant centralized government with 3 branches of government. Your James Madisons, your Alexander Hamiltons, John Jay, of course, who wrote the Federalist Papers. George Washington would be considered a pro-Constitution Federalist, but many people were concerned. So your Anti-Federalists were people who did not want this overreaching, larger-than-life federal government that would control states, or at least that's what they perceived. Your Anti-Federalists are people like Patrick Henry from New York. I think the book said Sam Adams from Massachusetts, John Hancock. So some of those people who were in the game early on with the independence movement were opposed to the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson was out of the country. John Adams was out of the country, and so they were not involved in the creating of the Constitution. Okay, and then real quickly, there were a couple other things that I made note of. The Treaty of Greenville was established after what's the name of the battle? The Battle of Fallen Timbers with Tecumseh and the Prophet. And the Treaty of Greenville was actually written during the George Washington administration. I think the Battle of Fallen Timbers happened in 1791. And so out in that Ohio territory, as the settlers were moving west, Tecumseh had organized a confederation, and his brother, the Prophet, was encouraging the native tribes to resist the white man, go back to their old way of doing things, and to prevent them from settling. So they had begun to harass the settlers. I read to you the account of Little Turtle, which was the slaughter of the 1,000 or so men and women that had traveled out to stop the harassment. And eventually, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which was a response to St. Clair's defeat, the Washington's army defeated Tecumseh and the Prophet, and they signed the Treaty of Greenville, which essentially sets into motion a precedent, the way the Indians are going to be handled moving forward. And so they were an obstacle, obviously, to Western movement. People were afraid. They were afraid of the Indians. They were afraid of conflict. And so they needed to be eliminated, basically, or at least settled or assimilated. And so in this battle was a big defeat for them. And so the treaty sort of said, we defeated you, we're sorry we're taking your land, but here's some money for your land, and we will continue to give you money to support you, almost as a acknowledgement that there has been an injustice, but not really knowing how else to handle it. And so that sets forth a future in which Native Americans are going to be fought with, conquered, a treaty is going to be signed. We're going to pay a small sum for their land, and then offer some of the members of the tribe that are willing to take the money, kind of a monthly stipend. I think they call it annuity or something in the book. And that's kind of how things move forward from there. They call it, an annuity system. And the one other thing is that, I don't know that I made this clear. I think I botched it a little bit, but once the Constitution was voted on in Philadelphia, it then had to go out to the states for ratification. Now, the way that the Constitution calls for an amendment is that 2/3 of the House and Senate have to approve of the amendment, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures or special state conventions ratify the amendment. There has never been an amendment to the United States Constitution that has been ratified in special state conventions. It's always happened in state legislatures, with the exception of the Constitution wasn't an amendment, but it was a new document. It was a change from the Articles of Confederation. And so it is the only, I don't know even what to call it, situation in which special state conventions were called to ratify by 9 out of 13 this new Constitution. So I think I said previously that it happened in state legislatures. It actually happened in state conventions, which are different than state legislatures. State legislatures are voted on by the people of the states. State conventions, if I recall correctly, the state legislatures pick delegates to go to these state conventions, and so they're chosen sometimes out of the state legislatures, perhaps even out of the community as a whole, and those people chosen are then go to these special state conventions where they voted whether they wanted to adopt the new Constitution or not. And I don't think I made that clear. So I think those are the only things that came to my mind. So I think you guys are ready for the quiz. The quiz is going to come open at 10 o'clock tomorrow. So from 9:30 to 10, watch this video, do any prep that you need to, and then it will come open at 10 o'clock, and there are 22 questions on it, and only two of them have, a couple of them have pictures. There's no major reading passages, I don't think, and so I'm going to give you 20 minutes to complete it. That should be sufficient amount of time to complete the quiz. So obviously it's a closed note, closed book, closed internet, closed texting a friend quiz. It's just like the quizzes you would take here. I'm gonna upload the Word document, and then there will be an answer key in a Google Doc. And so that's all I have for you today. And then there is a reading assignment for Friday. We're gonna go ahead and jump into chapter 8, even though we're up on the heels of a